Hello, and welcome to Case with Learn at BI Norwegian Business School. This is a part of a series we're creating together to explore the main challenges and opportunities in creating good AI as part of the BI course Responsible AI Leadership. Welcome also to our guest, Robindra Prabhu, who is a data scientist with NAV IT Data Insights, and my co-host, Samson Esaias, who's an associate professor at the Department of Law and Governance at BI. So,
thank you so much.
Lovely to see you, Robindra. If I may, on a personal note, we used to work together in the wonderful Teknologirådet.
Oh,
and
okay.
I remember you as our digital geek, if I may say. You have your PhD, and you have a kind of you were not talking about digitalization just for fun. You were super ambitious on behalf of our society when it comes to digitalization. So I'm super excited now.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction.
So actually, I'm going to ask you to both introduce yourselves, please, and then also maybe tell our listeners, both the students from BI and the others, on what do you want them to be listening for in this conversation. We have about 30 minutes to talk about responsible AI, fairness, explainability, data usage in applied AI to public crucial services. NAV is the heart of our society, and how it applies AI will be super important. So first of all, please, Samson and then Robindra, who are you, and what do you want to talk about and why?
Okay, so Samson Esaias, course responsible for this AI responsible leadership course, together with Professor Christian Fischler. And of course, I have a legal background, and I have been working with law and technology for several years. And I also teach now courses, in the intersection between law and technology, including, of course, data protection law, a bit of competition law, basically looking at some of the new also legislative initiatives that we have now in the EU, including the AI Act, the Data Act, Data Governance Act.
So one of the lawyers we need in the future, because you don't dismiss digitalization, you actually try to fix it.
Yeah. So the objective with this podcast was Nav. We came in contact with Robindra and Nav through Kari Lohman from the Data Protection Authority, and the idea was to have also one case from the public sector where they are trying to develop an AI-based technology in providing their services, and we wanted to see, what kind of technologies they are working with, and what are they using it for, and of course, what are the challenges, legal challenges they are facing, and how they are trying to tackle those challenges. And I think, Sylvia, you alluded to some of the issues in relation to fairness, especially when we are talking about the use of AI in the public sector. We have basically to make sure that the technology is fair. And then we have also requirements for explainability, transparency. So perhaps I think Robindra will give us an insight into some of those challenges and how they are trying to deal with them.
Robindra.
Yes, well, as you said, I'm a data scientist with NAV IT. I have a background, perhaps a geeky background in experimental particle physics, where I spent a lot of time analyzing huge amounts of data. And then realized that a lot of the techniques that we were applying to that data, not very different techniques, were applied elsewhere because there was so much data being produced outside of our research center in society. And that was I remember that was a bit of an eye opener that my colleagues were starting to apply similar techniques elsewhere. Super interesting. And so I after a stint in research, I joined the Norwegian Board of Technology to explore these issues further. I always had sort of an eye for the public sector, huge opportunities there. But then I also realized, and I think that was an eye-opener for me, joining Teknologirådet, that it isn't a technology that comes with, it's not just sunshine. There are definitely some challenges here, and they are very thorny issues that not obvious how we navigate. So that brings me to like how I landed here at NAV, because when NAV opened up, we're seeking data scientists to explore this field. I mean, for me, with the passion for the public sector, with the passion for data, for doing this in a responsible way, I couldn't think of a better place to do this, and I've been here since.
Okay, so I want to kind of just serve in a couple of scenarios, examples. So I'm thinking when it comes to fairness and public services, we've heard about cases where people got denied insurance or some welfare money because of maybe stricter interpretation of their position by the AI than what's fair. Maybe there were some assumptions that shouldn't have been there. Maybe there was some biased data. And then if you want to ask, well, why didn't I get this service or this money or this loan? You might get an answer that we don't know. It's just the AI that says so. And that's the explainability problem.
Yeah.
In Norway, we have a lot of our public services delivered by NAV. So when you go on maternity leave, when you're born, when you die, and actually everything in between, work, unemployment benefits, etc. All of this is managed in one institution, which is very rare, and that is NAV. That means you have a lot of data about what the population of Norway is doing, but also huge responsibility to kind of supply these services in a good way. So can you help me where the problem arises with data and AI related to this?
Well, I think you touched on it. Actually, I think that is the essence of what you just said. We have a unique institution in Norway, right? We've put all these public services, everything from early childcare to your unemployment benefits, your sick leave benefits, everything that sort of make up the backbone of the Norwegian welfare system under one roof. And there's a lot of I know there's a lot of opinions about what NAV does and how it operates but there's also a lot of trust that goes into this, right? Trust in managing all this in a way that is congruent with the ways that we want this to operate. Now, what happens is that so we have all this. It's just like you said, there's lots of data from all these different services under one roof. Doesn't mean that we can connect them all together. It's not that straightforward. But the data is there, and it's actually not half bad, right? I think many countries would be envious of us if you look at the sort of the quality of the data that we have in the public sector. Although we like to complain as data scientists, it's actually not all that bad, and that gives us opportunities, but it also challenges the sort of what kind of a welfare state do we want in the future? What are the normative and what kinds of values do you want to shape the future of that?
Sorry, I have to ask you, and this goes back to Samson that can help us actually remind our students, both from BI and otherwise, on the two concepts of fairness and explainability, and perhaps even data bias. But you said, Robindra, data is not half bad, which means we have quite good silos, relatively structured data, all connected across the silos with our personal ID number, going back maybe 70 years, which is really quite unique. Maybe Iceland beats us, but not many more. and then you were saying it sets some normative questions. What kind of a state do we want? So do you mean do we want? Is it like a question like should our state, our public sector, give equal rights to everybody? Do we ensure that, or do we want to stop them from knowing too much about us? Or what do you think are the thorniest kind of normative issues?
Okay, well, if I had to pick, that's a hard one. There are many issues that arise, but I think one that is sort of very, very pertinent is that we have the opportunity, in a sense, and I'm not saying this is straightforward. There are definitely legal conundrums here, but to be to find ways to be more sort of event driven, if you like, right? To understand the circumstances around a person and what kinds of services that person then requires. That allows us to perhaps be more proactive. I'm not saying that we should be, but it perhaps allows us to be more proactive.
Let's say I lose my job, or I lose my child, or I lose my husband. You could be serving me, and I might think this is great, or I might think this is terrible.
Exactly. And there are many ways we could do this, right? We could be very proactive, where we could also sort of, maybe you don't need to apply for this benefit, right? Because we know that you sort of qualify, and we make sure that you get it. These kinds of they have their issues, but it's something that I think that we should discuss more widely. What kind of role do we want us to take in the future? Coming back one step, because that is sort of that's maybe somewhat in the future. There's also a case of what do we do right now, and if you look at, for example, the tasks that we have now, for example, matching users to unemployed people to jobs out there, for example, we have tremendous opportunities in that space with digital technologies. It's something that we have been tasked to do, and we need to decide whether this is one of the ways that we should be doing that, with all that entails. We have data that gives us some idea of what works and what doesn't. And maybe we should use that information to, for example, say, well, I think this service would fit you because of this and this and that, because people in a similar position have benefited from this service, for example. Or, we think, as we did in one of our cases, this is going to be prolonged sick leave. If we know that in advance, maybe we can prepare for that, the follow-up of that, in a very different way from what we can do right now.
Yeah, I think very interesting. I think we can just then make it a bit concrete in terms of the case that you mentioned, Robindra. So can you tell us a bit, what is this AI-based tool that NAV has developed, and that was of interest also for the AI sandbox at the Data Protection Authority? So if you can give us the functions, what was the functions of the service, and then we can go perhaps to these normative questions. What kind of challenges did you see coming, and how you try to address them?
Yeah, sure. So I should say upfront that before we dive into this, that we actually considered a handful of different cases for the sandbox. So and they all had their merits, but this particular one we picked because it allowed us to dig into some very sort of deep fundamental questions in law, and also provided some very practical handles, we think, on how we should think about governance and inspection of public sector algorithms in the future. So what does this tool do? Well, we all fall ill from time to time, sadly, and sometimes it takes us a little longer to get well. And one of the beauties of the Norwegian welfare system is that's fine. We've got your back covered if that happens, financially, but also to assist you back to full employment if you need assistance. And sometimes that assistance could be just because you can't really return back to the job that you initially had. It's just not possible after your illness. Maybe you need to reorient towards a different job. Maybe you need your workplace to adapt to new needs that you have. These are the things that we are supposed to assist with and do assist with. The problem, if you like, one of the problems is that we have a huge volume of incoming sick leave notices, and we don't. Norway actually has one of the highest sick leaves in the in Europe, I've heard. We don't know which one of those is going to develop into a long-term sick leave, and which one is just sort of going to fizzle out after a given time. So right now, there's no way that we can actually plan and prepare other than to just sit and wait and see if it develops into a long-term sick leave. So this team looked into this problem and thought, well, what if we can try to create a model that feeds on, for example, your type of illness, your profession, your work history, your sick leave history, etc., and then tries to predict whether this would be a long-term sick leave or how long is it going to be. And that prediction can be used for a lot of things in principle, but this particular case wanted to use that prediction to assist in deciding whether we need to call that person for a so-called dialogue meeting. And a dialogue meeting is a meeting between the employer and NAV and the person on sick leave to discuss, what kinds of adaptations do we need to make in the workplace to assist a swift return. So we have a lot of these meetings. We think a lot of them are unnecessary, just because we don't know which ones will develop into long terms and which will be short. And this tool would then help decide, along with other kinds of information, whether, should we call for a meeting or should we not call for a meeting?
Yeah, quite interesting. So I think if you can then give us an idea, what kind of data are you using in developing the technology, and what kind of concerns do you have when using that data in building this model?
So the data that goes into into this model, and I have to say that I'm not on the team that actually developed the model. I worked on explaining and the fairness assessment of it. But it like I said, it's trained on data from previous sick leaves, from your type of illness, your profession, things like that we think are relevant for the duration, right? So that's what's fed into the model. Information that goes into your into your sick leave follow-up process is what this feeds on. It's not straightforward though, and it raises some very interesting questions. For example, this is a decision support system. But it's using a lot more information than is currently being used by caseworkers, right? And that is part of the beauty of these models. They can actually process a lot more information than we can do today. But that is also a legal problem, because what does that even mean, right? We have a history of looking at these sick leaves and following it up in a certain way, looking at certain, things like your profession or your age or whatever, right? And now if you're looking at all kinds of other things in addition, that might, like your full history, or, did it increase over the last month? Did it decrease over the last month? Things like that. Then what does that mean in a legal sense? Another very interesting thing, I think, is you're training a model here, right? So I'm using my data and your data, Sylvia, to say something about Samson's sick leave. And that is absolutely unprecedented in public administration. We're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to use data, your data, Samson, to say something about your sick leave, not my data to say something about your sick leave.
Yeah, I think that's, sorry.
I just want to ask, because I don't understand, and this is probably where I'm being a little too naive and blue-eyed, but I'm hoping that we as a country can continue this wonderful welfare system that we have. It is based then on an efficient application of this welfare system, which means, the reason why Norwegians pay tax is because we believe that it's being both collected properly and used properly. And similarly with the welfare system. So why do we consider this such an ethically troubling thing? I mean, if this was something that would, then suddenly make my insurance cost much more or something, but basically it's just trying to ensure that we divide this welfare wealth in the fairest possible manner. And I do not understand why we are so worried about the state having this data and using this data, as long as there is some sort of a democratic process about, what does welfare really mean and what does fairness mean, etc. I mean, I don't want people to be, faking long-term sick leaves with my tax money.
No, and like the efficiency argument is one of the arguments that motivated this as well, right? We want to we want to focus on the long-term sick leaves that need a follow-up rather than spend time on those that actually never qualify for meeting anyway, right? That's a waste of time and resources for us, and also for the people that we, and for the employer and maybe the doctor and for the person on sick leave, right? If you don't need a meeting, why hold it? Nobody wants to meet, nobody wants to have this meeting unless you actually have to, and it's beneficial. So yes, that is definitely part of it. I think that what one has to also appreciate in this is that we need to do it in an efficient way, but we need to find avenues for for efficiency that maintain a sense of the principles, the underlying principles that form public administration. And this principle that, it is the data on my sick leave that informs decisions about me, not your data that informs decisions on me. That's a fundamental thorny issue. And it might be fine. It might be fine that we do this, in a sense. It's a statistical aggregate. We're looking at people that look like you, etc. You could argue like that, but it needs to be, we need to debate it, and we need to sort of agree on it. Like you said, it needs to be democratically codified that this is in line with the principles of our law.
Can I just throw in one kind of...
I can also add a bit in relation to Sylvia's question. So, of course, you mentioned this idea of why do we need to really worry? I mean, of course, we have trust in the Norwegian government, in the Norwegian democratic system. But, of course, one of the reasons we have trust is because there are actual existing rules that make sure that our data is not abused. And of course, Robindra alluded to one of these principles of that if NAV is going to make a decision about me, then they have to based on my data, but that the data has to be accurate as well. And this is basically one of the core principles under the General Data Protection Regulation as well. So they have to make sure that this data is accurate and is relevant for the decision they are trying to make. Plus, we have seen also experiences where actually very democratic countries, such as the Netherlands, where the social service agency there, they tried to use some kind of AI tool to predict, to kind of detect fraud in childcare services. And which basically, because it wasn't robust, it wasn't tested, they didn't engage in this discussion of what concerns might arise, then it led to, discrimination, where many of the people that have been identified as trying to cheat the system were basically people with immigrant background. So the immigration became kind of one of the factors for related, for kind of cheating the system. And actually that kind of led for the government to resign. So this is actually one of the few cases where use of AI and concerns of discrimination have had also kind of significant consequences as well in terms of the government. So it's not just the fact that we have a democracy in the country and rules is not going to make sure that things would not go wrong unless you go through this robust system of testing. And that's why, for example, the AI sandbox that the Data Protection Authority is developing is quite useful in that sense.
So
just a question, and then please don't lose your thread, because I have two worries here. One is, why don't we then say, okay, fine, this service was biased, it was unfair, but it has to do with, historical data and maybe old biases. So let's correct it. Let's use this experience to make the AI better than history, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's one question I have. Rather than saying, "Oh, he was wrong, we'll just stop doing anything more,"
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is that really worries me is this kind of differentiation between use and abuse of data, because frankly, everything that Silicon Valley does is about use of data for future profiteering, monetization, right? And then if the state tries to do that, even to give you services that are for free, that are welfare, that are health, that are education, then suddenly you talk about abuse of data. And I don't know, I just want to challenge both of you and the students to think about, why are we so much stricter against the public sector and our own state than against Silicon Valley or China?
Yeah, I think Robindra can take and I can.
Well, I think that's a fair question. I think we should bear in mind that a lot of the things that we're trying to do is happening around us elsewhere, and some of this, I believe, also like the reason I think we need to sort of grab the bull by the horns and handle these issues is because it is also a matter of relevance, right? Being relevant as a public sector institution in the future. So I think we need to explore these issues, but at the same time, I think there is a case for holding us to slightly different standards, and that is because people who come to us do not come to us voluntarily. I mean. I hope some do, but usually there's an asymmetric power relationship here. I'm not saying it's not there in some of the big Silicon Valley actors as well. There is also an asymmetric power relationship there, and that is also very deeply problematic. But we should be cognizant of that, and also they're not subject to the sort of democratic control that we are, and I think that's something we should preserve. So, and that is exactly, I think, why we decided to take this particular case to the sandbox, and that's because it was a fairly mature case. We had lots of cases with other thorny issues, some less than this, and some in different areas, but this was a fairly mature case. We had developed a model. We were ready to test it, and we'd also applied some of our internal principles, which are always, in flux and developing. But we had, as part of this, done something that we thought was unprecedented, namely tried our best to fairness assess the model before we deploy it. We built in explainability from the word go, from the very beginning. So it's not an add-on that we do at the end. It's something that we think about from the very beginning. And that was a lesson I think that we will repeat, because that was indeed very, very useful. So that was in order to do just what you said, Sylvia. We wanted to shorten the route to bring value, right? To reap the benefits that this technology affords. But in a way that sort of decreases the uncertainty regarding like the legal playing field, because while we have a law that governs the use of data, it's not entirely clear what that entails when it comes to machine learning development in practice. And this sounds vague, I know, but we don't really even know whether we can use the data to train a model for this particular purpose. Right? And we have a history of specifying these things in law, and we just do not have a legal framework that gives us any clear indication about whether this is okay, is it not okay, and if it's okay, how far can we go, and where is too far. And that's what we want to do. We want to open that debate, but we want to do that in a safe space rather than do something, end up on the front page, never comfortable. We wanted to give assurances that, both for ourselves and for the country at large, that what we're doing is actually, in line with current thinking is actually, is by and large correct. And foster trust and nourish the trust that we know that we enjoy every single day. Also, when we do these new things with technology. And if I may, like a final point, it's just that yes, Silicon Valley also does this, but we are, we're a large public sector player in Norway. And with that, I think
we
certain responsibility falls on us. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think if we can spend a couple of minutes just making this fairness and explainability challenges a bit concrete. So in your case, what were your concerns? What kind of, for example, fairness issues were basically driving the work that you were trying to do? And give us a bit concrete example. And then, of course, to the explainability, often there is this debate about, of course, some models, they learn on their own based on the data. And for many people, at least even for those who have developed this technology, it would be very difficult. Okay, if I was called, for example, based on your tool data, if I was called for the meeting with NAV, then how do you explain, okay, what was the criteria for selecting me? Why not another person? So if you can elaborate a bit with a bit of examples on those two issues.
Okay, so this is a huge topic, and I always find it very challenging to make it very, very, to take a position. Yes, exactly. Because it's hard. And the reason is that, there is no such, I'm going to I always tell my colleagues that there is no such thing as a fair model. There's not, it's not an accidental feature that a model is unfair. It's a feature of the model. It doesn't matter that your data is biased or is not biased, unless you have a completely homogeneous population where everyone is exactly the same. You're very likely to get a model that will have, in some way or another, differential treatment of a certain group of people. It is an unavoidable property of this model.
That's actually the feature, That's what you want the model to do as well.
And that's the other side of it, right? You also want to have differential treatment. That's also built into it. Otherwise, why would you do it?
Sorry. I think this is a super important point. And I'd like you both to kind of just stop for a sec and maybe repeat what you just said. So what you're saying is that this differentiation is actually the feature. What you're trying to say is that we ask the AI to look for patterns in our data. And if it can't find any patterns, if it says everybody's the same, everybody do the same, then it didn't do anything for us, right?
Right. So there's two sides to this. So one side is exactly that the reason that you do this in the first place is that you want to differentiate, right? In this case, we want to differentiate between long-term and short-term absences. And we think that certain salient features point to like long-term and short-term ones, right? That's what we want to do. We want that differentiation. Now, we do not want that differentiation to be, we want that differentiation to be lawful. The Norwegian term for this is saklig forskjellsbehandling. Like we want it to be. Yes, I get.
So, for example, in your case, you want the difference. If you are going to call A or Samson or Sylvia, should be based on, for example. Based on my sickness, based on the job occupation, not based on my gender,
not your color, or
based on my color.
And that's one side of it. The other side of it is that that if everyone were this, we know that our data is not. I said that we didn't have half bad data, and that's true. We have a lot of interesting data. We also know that data is colored by all kinds of collection processes, right? Interactions between humans in offices, caseworkers, and users, and the systems that we have designed, over the years, the data, that all of that has colored the data. Policies have colored the data. Everything, it's huge, it's complicated. There's no such thing as neutral data. And then added to that, the data challenge, we also know that even if that weren't the case, there are always going to be majorities and minorities in a population. You can always find a minority You could always say, and that minority does not have to have the same properties as the majority. But when you train a model, you're basically saying, we expect you to behave in this particular way.
Yeah.
And they could be very, very real reasons that have nothing to do with bias for a minority to behave in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? We know, for example, that, Parkinson's disease, for example, is, I think, more prevalent in men than in women.
Yeah.
I think that's the right way around. But I think, so there are differences, and they are there. Some of them might be due to societal bias. Some of them might not be due to societal bias, but other things. It doesn't really matter. The point is that the differences are there. Once those differences are there, it's very hard. It's very, very hard to create a model that treats everyone in the same way. So our starting point is always, it's much better to assume that your model is going to be unfair. Do the tests, check, and show that it isn't in the ways that are important to you. And so the challenge in this particular case was to say, look, we have some tools, and that's one of the beauties of these models as well, I think, right? It's not that we don't have biased systems today with humans. Humans are biased too. Models allow for inspection in a way that these systems we have today don't, right? So that gives us an opportunity to dissect and probe these issues. Not perfect, but it gives us one tool. And I think we would be remiss if we don't use that tool. So we say, look, let's just assume that we have a bias, probe that bias, and then decide whether that is, is it tolerable? Is it not tolerable? And to dive into that question as to whether this is okay or not okay, you have to go back to law and what is the notion of fairness that is built into the law that governs sick leave in Norway, and that's hard. That is hard.
So Samson, we have maybe 2-3 minutes more, and you also I don't know if you covered your question about regulatory gaps. Where do you want to go?
Yeah, I think I think that's a good point, but I think we can relate that to this explainability. So one requirement under the GDPR and many other laws is transparency. That you need to tell the user how you're making decisions, how you're using their data. And of course, in the literature, in data science, in the machine learning, there is this idea of black box. Especially with some models, even though developers are unable to explain what's happening. So if he can touch upon that, Robindra, how is this gap? How are you trying to deal with this? You have these models and then this obligation of being transparent and explaining what's happening behind the box.
Yeah, so it's absolutely right. I mean, this is an issue that these models are often harder to explain. Again, there are also, a bunch of tools out there that allow for some kinds of explanations. They have their issues, but they allow for new ways of explaining and shining a light on these models. So we thought, let's try to harness those opportunities that come with this technology to address this challenge. And this challenge manifests itself in many ways in this particular model, but in particular, we want it to be a decision support system, right? So if you want a decision support system, you don't want the caseworker just to follow the recommendation blindly. That's not that's not decision support. Decision support is something that allows for critical thinking. And so we realized from the functionality of this is that we need the caseworker to be able to contest. Because otherwise there's no way of buying into it either. There's no trust. You don't understand it. You need to be able to contest it. And in so doing, we need to say, look, for this particular sick leave, we are predicting, 120 days. And the reason we predict 120 days is because this and this and this factor contribute to increasing it, while these factors contribute to decreasing it. And the mathematical framework for doing that is fairly advanced, but we took that and we put that into a decision support system and tried to test that with caseworkers, and also found that without anything like this, it was very hard to get any buy-in whatsoever. Because
so
why would you?
The human person would be able to communicate to the person. Okay, so we're taking into account perhaps your type of sickness or the kind of job you're doing.
Well, not just that you're taking into account, because we can give that information up front to the user, right? This is what we're looking at. But in your particular case, in your particular case, this is the prediction because X, Y, Z, right?
Okay.
So and that allows you to say, no, that is not right. That's just not correct, or I don't agree with that, or that doesn't really make sense. It allows you to contest it because you have a rationale and explanation for that prediction. At least that was the idea.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So we built that into like the decision support, and I think the key lesson we've learned is, rather than sort of is that you can't do that after the fact, right? You need to start thinking about this in the very beginning, and I think that's for all developers out there. It's not something you can add on in the end. Just like you optimize for outcomes for your performance metrics and stuff, you have to start thinking about fairness and explainability from the very beginning and build it into your development cycle.
We have to conclude this fireside chat, but I'm taking away many really interesting both examples and ideas, but maybe the most important is just like you summarized it now, Robindra, in my head. Two things. One is that you have to design for explainability and fairness from the very start, but then number two, it means that even before that, you have to make some really difficult decisions about what you mean by those things. And this regulation is not in place yet. So you might have to basically make some normative, challenging decisions while we await that regulation.
Yeah, sometimes the regulation might not be there. Sometimes it might be there, but it's just not, it's not laid out in mathematical terms in legal literature. So you need to sort of translate between the law and the very mathematical expressions that govern these models. I don't know if that's something that can be done, but it's something that I really wish for, is some sort of a mapping in that in that space. And it needs to be said, and I cannot stress this enough, is that this is like quintessentially a cross-disciplinary exercise. You cannot do this alone. You cannot let a sole data scientist do this. It's not something the lawyers, the legal experts can do alone either. You need to sit together, and we've only been able to do anything in this space because we've all sat down. The legal coaches, the data scientists, the product owners, the domain experts on together to see what makes for the right choices here, and design hugely important, right? You can have the best mathematical methods in the world, if you cannot create a tangible framework for explaining your model, you're just as far.
Very nice. Samson, if you are to choose one thing you'd like your students to remember, what would it be?
Yes, I think Robindra actually put really very interesting point. So normally in the discussions about, new technologies, AI, you have this, ambition of, it's going to revolutionize how we do things, which is in a positive way. And sometimes you kind of bake in some of the concerns as some of little obstacles in there that needs to be addressed. But the starting point Robindra talked about is, you need to assume things are going to be unfair and actually going to benefit those in power, or going to exacerbate the problems we have. If you take that assumption as the starting point, I think you have a better chance of coming up with a better product and a fair product. So I think that mentality that we need, that this is going to be unfair. That starting point would be, I think, a very good mentality to have. It's not because it will actually be that, but it would give you a good starting point to be very critical, to build your systems in a robust way, and also in ethical and legally compliant way.
Yeah, so perhaps I was I came on it a bit too strong, and I want to say that all models out there are unfair, but what I want to say is that they're definitely imperfect, right? And I think it for us, it's proven very useful to just accept that from the very onset, and then instead try to show that, look, this is imperfect in ways that we can live with, or, this is definitely not imperfect in ways that we can live with. In most respects, at our very first assessment, this model was absolutely fine. And it was only in one particular domain that we found a real issue. But it's so much better to uncover that issue before you actually deploy a model.
Yeah.
Very nice. I learned a lot. Thank you both very much for that. And on behalf of our students as well, thank you for a great inspirational and educational conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.